gangster. Tryna get a ride, tryna slide. I'ma check, yeah, I stay around the.
Welcome to the booksaboutsports.com special feature. We have Dan Grunfeld with us today. I just happened to read Dan's book, By the Grace of the Game. Dan's obviously an accomplished author, former Stanford Cardinal, professional basketball player, and in multiple areas. And I'm excited to have Dan today to talk about the book and just his inspiration behind writing it, and just share with you some of the stories that really resonated with me and were very touching, to be quite frank. So Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, John. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Can you start just providing the viewers just maybe a brief synopsis on the book and why you wrote it? And obviously there's a lot here. So just kind of give us a brief 101.
Absolutely. So, I was a basketball player, as you mentioned. My family's name is kind of synonymous with the game of basketball, but not because of me, because of my dad. So my dad's name is Ernie Grunfeld. He's a longtime NBA player and executive. And so he's very well known in the world of sports and in the world of basketball. But what was not well known until my book came out is that my dad's the only player in NBA history whose parents survived the Holocaust. And actually, I did a year and a half of research preparing to write this book. And the research suggests that my dad is the only athlete in any of the major American sports leagues whose parents are Holocaust survivors. And so my dad came to America from communist Romania at the age of 9 years old, didn't speak a word of English, had never touched a basketball. And about a dozen years later, he was standing on top of the Olympic podium as a gold medalist for the United States, right? So it's very much an American dream, kind of rags to riches story and that type of thing. And Cinderella, right? That's what sports is all about, right? And so that's very much the nature of the story. And as you know, John, because you read the book, despite my dad's great success and some of the things that I did, it's really my grandmother who's the star of our family and the star of our story, right? Because she's a hero. She saved people during the Holocaust. She saved herself, of course. Most of her family was killed. My grandparents' family was killed. So very, very hard background. My grandmother just turned 98 years old. I got off the phone with her about an hour ago. So she's the greatest. And, she really inspired, my dad to work as hard as he did, me work as hard as I do. And so, yeah, it's all about her, really. And I wrote the book because I just grew up understanding the profound impact that basketball had on my family, and being so close to my dad, being so close to my grandmother, I just knew, wow, this game has done so much for us. So once I kind of had a little time and space in my life and I love to write, I said, this is a story I want to tell.
When you started doing this research, obviously there's people in here. I don't know if you ever met your uncle, Lucy. I don't believe so. Your grandmother, you talked about your grandfather, and just the entire family history. I feel like there had to have been so many moments in that research of people talking about these individuals, what happened to them, some of the stories that you recalled in the book, that I'm sure just made you pause and say, wow, this stuff really happened. I'm sure that was an emotional journey for you. Probably very different from a lot of us who are writing things based on historical facts that have maybe little meaning, but obviously nothing even close to what you were writing about.
Absolutely. And you mentioned my uncle Lutzi. It's Hungarian, right? And
yeah,
he was 8 years older than my dad, and he was my dad's hero. So when they got to the United States, they didn't speak English, but what my dad called his brother in their native language, Hungarian, translates to English as my king, right? So you can imagine a little brother calling his big brother my king, right? And so my uncle was diagnosed with leukemia a few months after arriving in the United States, and he passed away within a year. And despite, my grandmother had 5 siblings, both parents killed in the Holocaust. My grandfather had both of his sisters, both of his parents killed. Despite all that loss, my uncle dying tragically at that young age, right when they got to America, was such a hard thing for everyone. And, again, my book is called By the Grace of the Game, because my dad just went to the playground in Queens, New York to make friends, learn English, heal from the loss of his brother. He started playing basketball, and he became larger than life. And it was as if God shined down on him, really, because of all the hard things he went through, for basketball to come in his life and kind of take him in a different direction was incredible. The research process, you nailed it. It was emotional. And because you read the book, my family has experienced incredible highs, right? Like I told you, the top of the Olympic podium, and my dad was first round NBA draft pick and all these really cool things, but also the lowest lows that we could imagine, right? The Holocaust and my uncle passing tragically. That's what life is, right? Life is joy and pain and tragedy, triumph. And my research process kind of reflected that, right? There were times where I would wake up and I was so happy and energized because I was writing about my dad finding the game and becoming a star in New York City. And that was so fun. Yeah. But then there were mornings where I woke up with real sorrow because I'd have to recount my uncle dying at a young age, and my great-grandparents being murdered in Auschwitz, right? These are really hard things. Again, it took me a year and a half to learn all the history. I talked to so many people that allowed me to really piece those things together. But yeah, for me, like even during the research process, like I laughed, I cried, right? And that's kind of the way the book is, and that's how life is.
Can you talk about too just the pressure in your own life as your father's son, this family history? Not to give too much away in the book, but you tear your ACL at Stanford after just a monster year. You know, Dan was projected to potentially be a first-round draft pick, and all of a sudden, this all just kind of keeps, just crumbles, and it's like, where do I go from here, and how do I move forward? And I think for any of us, we all have some aspects of trauma. Obviously, life is relative that way, but describe maybe some of those things that happened to you, whether it was maybe mentally in your head, living under your father's shadow, or real things where, you're an NBA first round draft pick, and just with a snap of the fingers, it's like, will I ever play again?
Yeah. And because you read the book, like I just try to be very honest, right? When things were going well, they were going well. When things weren't, they weren't. There were things I dealt with that were hard, so I just try to be honest about everything. I talk about privilege a lot in the book because I'm so privileged. It's particularly relative to my family, right? My dad fled communism under duress, came to the United States an immigrant. My parents survived the Holocaust. Clearly, I have incredible privilege relative to them, but even just in the general world, right? I was born into a stable family, 2 loving parents, resources. My dad was a player for the Knicks when I was born, right? Like I had advantages. Now, worked hard, did all I could, took advantage, and I give myself credit for that, but it was all there for me, right? And then you got to own that, right? And so talk a lot about that, because it's something I always just wanted to earn whatever came to me, right? You want to make good on your opportunities, and knowing that I had family who didn't have those opportunities, and there's so many people who don't have them, I wanted to make good on them, and I did, right? So that I did all I could with that, but definitely a privileged person. And there's another layer to it, in that my dad was kind of prominent in what I really cared about, which was basketball. And he was the general manager of the Knicks. He was this big time player, and then the president of the team. And so me growing up being a basketball player, it was always, oh, of course he made the all-star team. That's Ernie's son, right? Of course they run the plays for him. That's Ernie's son. Part of it just comes with the territory, right? And the world is that way. And so it fueled me. It angered me. I don't think I would have gotten to Stanford, which was my dream school, as you know from the book, because my grandmother lives 25 minutes from campus to this day. That's why I wanted to go there, aside from it being a very good school and good basketball program. So there were other reasons. But so I wouldn't have gotten there without kind of that motivation driving me. But it also held me back at times, because I put so much pressure on myself. I felt the pressure from other people, not my parents, right? They didn't pressure me, which I'm very lucky for. Another privilege, actually, right? Because a lot of people feel that from their parents. I didn't. But I always felt the eyeballs from other people, right? And so I have a lot of empathy for those who have prominent parents who are trying to live up to that, even though, again, like it's complicated because you have all the advantages. So like it's very easy for the world to be cruel, but as human beings, as people who have your own ambitions, your own motivations, it's hard when you feel like people are judging you and are not giving you credit for the things you do just based off of your own kind of abilities.
Yeah, I thought you did such a fantastic job of telling us about these people in your life. But one of the things I took from it is your dad had gone through so much, experienced so many highs. But I thought it was really interesting how you described your dad's, I guess, reactions to kind of anything you did, and just how supportive he was. And he always seemed to be super proud of you, kind of no matter what. And he never, I guess, pushed you to have to be him or to achieve something on a stat sheet. It was kind of like, hey, do your best, proud of you, play hard. And so I was kind of moved by just the simplicity of how you portrayed your father in the book.
Thank you for that. Honestly, that's how he was, and he is to this day. And I'm really lucky for that. And I think, and from the book, there's a lot there. It's so complicated, but I think his background and knowing what his parents went through, what he went through, he has a lot of perspective, right? So yes, he always tried to tell me, work hard. Just work hard. Whether you achieve your goals or not, or succeed or don't, whatever that means to you, if you work hard and give everything you have, it's all worth it. And it all takes care of itself. So, and I mentioned this book, like he would always like brag, quote unquote, about me to his friends, but about my grades, right? Not so like, and they'd always say that, like, your dad, whenever he talks about you, he doesn't talk about like your points per game. He talks about your grades, so he tried to like make sure like he supported me as a student, supported me as a player. Another one of my great privileges, like really, really lucky to have two parents who were just like really supportive.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I thought was interesting about your book too, and I had a lot of people that questioned whether I should put something about my wife in my own book. And I thought, okay, this is my story. It's transparent. What kind of story do you want to tell? And when you kind of opened up about maybe some of the struggles and then kind of where you were at a certain point in your life, you meet this woman named Sam. She kind of maybe changes your perspective a little bit. You guys fall in love, you get married, but those are things that obviously you don't have to share with anyone. You chose to do it, but I thought it was a really cool part of the story and just kind of spoke to the transparency with how the book was written.
Thank you for that. Yeah, again, wanted to tell an honest story. And someone told me, kind of like writing peer mentor of mine when I was first started out, said, you can have anything, but you can't have everything, right? So you have to just make decisions. And as I think about my life, the trajectory of the story, everything, me meeting my wife, Sam, is such an important part. And this from the book, like basketball, I was obsessed with basketball. It was all I could see. It was all I did. But then I finally met someone who showed me, oh, there's some, and I was, I'm a family oriented person. So it's not that I didn't love my family, but you're young, you're motivated. That's really what you care about. But then I met a woman where I was like, oh, now she's my priority. You know what I mean? And like, now you think about, oh, we're going to have a family, and I wanted to reflect that to the reader about kind of my journey, my evolution of being so about basketball and living up to this history and honoring the people who came before me, but then realizing that the way I can actually do that is by, having a great family, having a happy life. And Sam is the core part of that. So I really appreciate you saying that. Once in a while, someone will reach out to me about the book and be like, and just make a similar comment, be like, your wife sounds amazing. I'm like, yeah, well, she is. And I'm like, thank you for calling it out. Because yeah, it was an important thing. The story doesn't exist. The book doesn't exist without that part, just because it's such an important part of the whole process.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. One other person that stood out to me was Frank, who was your trainer. And any probably college athlete has some horror stories of trainers or strength coaches, where you're like, oh my gosh, this guy's going to kill me. And, me and some of the Marquette guys, we talk about this, and talked to someone last week about just workouts in the summer before your freshman year of basketball. You're just like, I'm not going to survive to live in the day. But Frank was super interesting. I love how you described him, kind of this unorthodox style. But once you kind of bought into that, man, I mean, you guys were connected all the way through to even your surgery and helping you get back from tearing your ACL.
Absolutely. I had breakfast with Frank about a month ago when I was visiting my family. We were out with my grandmother in the Bay Area. So, we're still close to this day. Frank gained notoriety after training me because he's trained people much better than me and much more like, NBA all-star type players. And so people started to realize like, oh, Frank really, really can help people kind of develop. But to your point, you have to be willing to push yourself there because he's unorthodox, sprinting in the sand, carrying buckets, pulling sleds of people, like climbing up. Like we did stuff that was so unorthodox and so hard and grueling. And one thing that I had was heart at that point, right? Like I was motivated, I was disciplined. And, I was my sophomore year at Stanford, we were the number one team in the country and everything. And I was having a very poor personal year, but we were the top team in the country doing so well. And Frank was always telling me like, you got to work out with me, man. You have to work out with me. And I'm on the number one team in the country. I'm like, Frank, I got this, right? I'm good. Don't worry about it. And I had such a poor year. I missed a shot at the buzzer in the NCAA tournament where we got eliminated as a 1 seed, like the whole thing. And I finally said, you know what? Let me see. Let me go out and work out with Frank and just see what it's about. And after 10 minutes, I was like, I'm in. Because I could barely last 10 minutes. It was so hard. And I was like, man, if I push myself this hard, other people aren't, 99% of my competition is now pushing like this. And that's what I needed. And so, and from the book, like Frank's nickname, a lot of people call him Crazy Frank, right? Because he's a character and he is that, but he's also a genius in a lot of really interesting ways. And like, if you commit, he'll get the most out of you. And he did that with me. And I was, the most improved player in the whole country between my sophomore and junior years. And some of that was the opportunity that I had just by being older and having a, kind of a change. But a lot of that was Frank. Like he really helped me kind of push as hard as I could physically and mentally. So I owe him a lot.
Yeah. So I mean, you had a phenomenal career at Stanford. You graduate, you go to some, well, I shouldn't say training camps, but you have an opportunity to play summer league. You kind of even tell the story in the book, and I like just the realistic view that you had, I think, which was, I'm probably not good enough to play in the NBA, but it doesn't mean I can't play basketball professionally. And you do, and you play all over the world. Tell me about that experience, just leaving the United States, living abroad, playing with different teams, and just, there's not many people that get a chance to play Division I college basketball, much less play professionally, outside of the United States.
Yeah, it was great. It was a great run. And of course, that you mentioned my knee injury when I was having this amazing year, and I had this injury, which really was a setback. But despite it, got to play in some top leagues around the world, went to training camp with the Knicks, was one of the last guys cut. And actually, one of the Knicks assistants, Kenny Atkinson, who became a head coach in the NBA, and he was my workout guy, great guy. And he told me, still to this day, every time I see him, he goes, you should have made the team. So I felt like, and my window was small, right? So I wasn't a surefire NBA player. It had to be the right thing for me, right? And it just like, it never happened. And so once I got to Europe and I was doing well there, after my experience with the Knicks, I said to myself, my window is so small, but Europe is really the place for me right now. And that's where I finished my career. And so it was awesome. I mean, I played a year in Germany, 3 in Spain, 4 in Israel, won a championship in Spain, made lifelong friends. Yeah, I just, again, always thought I'd be playing in the NBA, but I didn't really even know that I could do what I always dreamt of doing. I would just do it in a foreign country where they spoke a different language and ate different food, which also was a great thing in my life because it broadened my horizons. I met interesting people, learned new things, and got to play at really high levels. So you have to kind of, and this goes back to my family story, right? Again, and we're talking basketball, which is wins and losses. Maybe it's a torn ligament. My grandparents it was life and death. I mean, quite literally, and so one of the lessons my grandmother's always kind of passed down about, not only the Holocaust, but just everything is you can't control what happens to you in life, but you can control your response to it. Right. And that's what it is. Like, you have a good career, you don't have a good career, you hurt your knee, you don't hurt your knee. You just have to put your best foot forward, work as hard as you can, let the chips fall where they may, and just be grateful for what you do have, and so I tried to have that perspective, not saying that I didn't have my long nights and headaches and regrets and, because that's life. Right. And I was very much like that in many different points, but looking back in particular, like I'm just grateful for the opportunity because it was a great run.
Yeah. You kind of already touched on this, but I guess my last question for you is, you write this basketball book, and a lot of basketball books are about you or the subject. This book was unique in that you rotated between kind of the story of your life, but also the people in it. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was just a really cool way to write the book, but also just a great tribute to your family and your grandmother. And like you said, your grandma's 98 years old and still plays, such a huge role in your life, and has taught your wife how to cook, and as a grandma to see a grandchild. So I thought it was awesome.
Thank you. And because you've written books, right? Like you have to make 1,000 decisions. And the biggest one I had to make was structure, because I had this, 3-4 generations, decades of history, right? And it was also intertwined. And I really enjoyed watching movies or reading books where it kind of alternated, and you would meet someone as a teenager, but then as a grandparent. Like The Godfather 2 is the best example in film, right? Where you see the Godfather as this old man, but then it's this like plucky upstart. And I was like, my dad loves those movies, so I grew up kind of like with The Godfather as a movies that matter. But I really appreciate that. And I was like, okay, maybe this is a way I can do it, right? I can talk about my grandmother before the war, before the Holocaust, her big loving family, right? And how that was broken up, but then my upbringing, and kind of go back and forth. And I just did it. It was just kind of a risk I took. And my wife was the first person to read the book, after it's kind of done. And that's the first question I asked, like, hey, like, does it work? Structure? And she goes, it works. It really works. And then since it's come out, I kind of got that feedback, and it just kind of, some things just work, right? It could have easily not worked, but it just happened to. And it was my way of trying to just like tie it all together. Because in my head, I was like, geez, Louise, how am I gonna, there's so much here, like the Holocaust and communism and fleeing and being an immigrant. But then there was like my journey, which those pieces really inform, right? So like that was my kind of attempt to tell it. And just, I appreciate the feedback, and I've gotten that pretty consistently. And it always makes me feel really good because, like, in my heart, I knew what this story has meant to me. So I wrote the book so that other people could kind of feel parts of that inspiration, that hope, actually, because there's a lot of sadness, but it's a happy story. It's a story of hope and inspiration because of what can happen in life and how people can react to it, particularly my grandparents and my dad. Right. I mean, listen, I do the best I can, but I grew up very differently. I'm not the hero. They are. And I always got so much inspiration from them. And that was just my hope for a reader, is like, I wanted readers to be able to access that same hope and inspiration.
Well said. Last question. Knicks cut you in summer league. Are you still a Knicks fan?
They cut me in training camp. So
Training camps, even
which
worse.
is also, which better and it's worse, right? Because you made it farther, but then you got closer.
Yep.
Listen, I'll always have a really soft spot in my heart for the Knicks because, you know, my dad was with the Knicks for 17 years. And when he came to America and his brother passed, and, you know, my grandparents opened up a fabric store in the Bronx, right? It's the whole immigrant story. My grandpa used to take the subway from the Bronx after work. My dad would take the subway from Queens after school. They'd meet at Madison Square Garden, buy the cheapest tickets they could afford and the nosebleeds, and they'd sit and watch the Knicks. And actually, you know, my dad loved Dave DeBusschere, you know, the great Knicks player of the 70s, you know, hustler, all heart. He wore number 22 for the Knicks. So his number 22 hangs in the rafters in Madison Square Garden. My dad's number 22 hangs in the rafters in Knoxville, Tennessee, where he played college basketball. It's because of DeBusschere, right? So, like, he literally learned the game of basketball watching the Knicks, then applied it on the playgrounds in New York. But then fast forward a few decades, he's playing for the Knicks, and then he's running the team. So it's like, holy cow, right? Like this escalated quickly, right? As we say, like, a lot happened there. And so I grew up all about the Knicks, right? All about the Knicks. So I always have, and then getting to play for them briefly and have that run, like, they'll always have a soft spot. I wouldn't say I'm a Knicks fan, because Knicks fans are rabid and they can't sleep. I'm not at that point, but I always have love for the team, just because, like, it's been such a big part of my family's life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming onto the show. Thank you for sharing your story. If you want to let people know where the book is available and where they can go and purchase a copy.
Amazon's always a good bet. I like to support local bookstores, but there's never any guarantees, right? It's available on Amazon and other places you get books, and audiobook, Kindle, softcover, hard, like it's there however you want to consume it. And just always grateful people pick up a copy or share it with someone they love, because it's a deep emotional story. And, you know, you called it a basketball book, which is interesting because, like, there's a lot of basketball, but I don't consider it a basketball book. There's actually a lot of Holocaust, and some people say it's a Holocaust book, but I don't consider it a Holocaust book. It's really a book about family, you know, and I think that's something we can all kind of relate to. There's a ton of basketball in it, you know, just to be objective, but yeah, so if people engage with it, I'm always really grateful.
Awesome. By the grace of the game, Dan Grunfeld, go pick up a copy. Thanks to Dan for writing this book, and thank you for coming on the show.
You got it, John. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.